and welcome to Sip Sip Hooray, the podcast where we talk about wine and the interesting people making it, selling it, and enjoying it without a whiff of the off-putting snootiness that can spoil what should be a good glass and a good time. On the pod today, when you look at a restaurant's wine list, what do you see? Well, once you stop panicking about trying to pick the right bottle, what do you see? Do you see equity, cultural and biodiversity, representation, affordability, fun? Our guest today believes all of that should be front and center on a wine list. He's made a career and a celebrated name for himself as a wine professional of color in New York City, where he is currently the wine director at Pinch Chinese in Manhattan. When he's not running the wine program at Pinch, he's writing thought-provoking articles for the online magazine Punch that aren't afraid to throw a punch at the status quo of the wine world. His efforts have won Miguel de Leon a James Beard Award, the first ever Top Som Award from the Michelin Guide, and a host of other accolades. He's brave and outspoken and just what the mostly white wine world needs today. We're excited to have Miguel de Leon join us. We are the two Marys who like to eat, drink, and be merry. I'm Mary Babbitt.
I'm Mary Orlin. Our guest today, Miguel de Leon, ignited a conversation with the Punch article titled, "It's Time to Decolonize Wine," back in June 2020. In it, Miguel details the challenges and indignities he's faced since choosing a life in wine, one that began more than a decade ago. Today, we'll explore where the wine industry and wine culture stands now in terms of progress, or lack thereof, on diversity, accessibility, equality, and inclusiveness. Miguel's latest journalistic endeavor, also on Punch, titled "So Long to the Sommelier," stirred up controversy once again. Miguel has a point and an important voice in what could be an inflection point in how we approach, talk, and communicate about wine. Is it time for wine speak to die and our somms fading away? We're so happy to have you, Miguel, here on the pod to dive into these issues and more. Welcome to Sip Sip Hooray.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we're really happy that you're joining us today and look forward to the conversation. I feel like we should start by getting to know you a little bit better. Can you give us a little bit about your personal background and then also how you got into the food and wine world?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born in the Philippines. I grew up in Manila, and I moved to the United States when I was young, about 9 years old. And then I went to schooling in Southern California in Orange County, moved up to the Northern California from near the Bay Area for college, and then moved out to New York almost 20 years ago now. So that's the very short life trajectory of what I've done. In terms of restaurants and food and wine, so in my collegiate career, after turning into an adult on paper, my mother and my stepfather were both very kind of adamant that I start to become an independent person very quickly. I was lucky enough to have scholarships through college, but I figured very quickly that I needed a job. And one of those very first jobs that I was able to get. So I went to school at UC Berkeley, and I was very lucky that my local restaurant was Chez Panisse, and I got my very first reservation job as a call-in reservationist. And this was before the age of computers and Open Table and Resi. So
Yeah.
I was stuck with pencils and taking credit card numbers on file on paper and index cards and slotting people in at predetermined reservation slots. We couldn't really find any. It was very traditional, very old school. Everything on paper kind of living. The reservation sheet was binders and binders and binders of paper, weeks upon weeks upon weeks, and we were having to kind of figure things out as we get along there.
That
Not
had to be
soon after.
intense because
Yeah,
Chez Panisse
absolutely.
was is so popular and what has always been. And so people probably were really intense about getting in, and you don't have a computer to help make it easier. It's all based on
That's right.
your
The
papers.
the first 15 minutes of the book's opening usually was about seven other assistants trying to outbeat nine other assistants, trying to get a reservation for 8 o'clock on Saturday because we would book out a month to the calendar day in advance. And my listening skills and my kind of like my people skills were born over the phone. And I think very quickly after that, they noticed that, they really needed some more, help on the floor. And I was a willing volunteer because I had heard that the situation with tips was wonderful. And
Uh-huh.
so I shifted my scheduling, kind of wanted to get my feet wet a little bit more in terms of, earning a little bit more money. And not long after, found out that the people that I was surrounded by were some of the most interesting, influential, and just warm-hearted people that I've ever had a chance to be part of my personal life and career.
Mm.
Um, Most notably, the gentleman who was running the wine directorship at the time at Shea was a gentleman named Jonathan Waters, no relation to Alice, who was running the restaurant. Um, and Jonathan had this huge, empathetic, golden heart about how to approach wine because he had spoken about making wine be part of the experience in a way that was more human or empathetic than I had ever thought of that product ever being. Um, it was one of the first times that I could consider, wine as food, thinking about wine as a way to kind of engage more of the human aspect and the more human impacts of what it can look like. Also bringing about the romance and the feeling and emotion about how you can feel when you first have a sip and have a bite, and how those two things can be magical and how they can interact. And then after moving to New York, I was kind of surrounded in very tough dining rooms. I was working for Thomas Keller and David Chang, and at about a breaking point in my mid-20s, I was burnt out of helping all these other people build empires and open restaurants. And at the same time, my palate was very much adjusting. So this would be around. I moved to New York around 2006, 2007. And so around 2010, 2011, 2012, there was a big kind of push, at least in the New York wine scene, to talk about sherry and the Jura and all of these kind of like
All
more
right. Mm-hmm.
undersung wine regions at the time. So we were kind of very much veering away from the ivory towers of Burgundy and the castles in Bordeaux,
Mm-hmm.
and more leaning into, I guess more like vineyard-driven places like the Loire Valley, or family-owned places in the Jura, and then more curious products like sherry, or more specialty luxury items like champagne. So I got my first taste of understanding wine in a way that I wanted to um, be more, uh, I guess, uh, invitingly curious about the whole process.
Sure.
I was a sake person to begin with. I had trained in sake under the Momofuku group, loved
Oh, wow.
it, like learned Japanese because of it, and got my certifications in that, and I thought that that was going to be my entire life. But the things that I learned in sake about like things not being taken away, or the process being very, imperfection was kind of okay in terms of the seek, and it was very philosophically grounding because it was so different from how I had approached beverage before, about thinking about perfect pairings and thinking about, what's the best, what's the most correct thing to do. And
Mm.
instead, this kind of thing opened up and broke apart about, you know, correctness isn't so much the goal anymore. I think it's more like, how do we maximize deliciousness? And that's something that I've taken from Momofuku basically since the first day that I stepped through that uh, office door, is that um, for every person, there's a different kind of delicious. And the approach from there, especially with like the daring things that we were doing in the wine lists, one of the most memorable ones that I helped make was we were opening a restaurant in Midtown, and the decision was made to do the wine list entirely from wines from the Jura, which was kind of unheard of at the time.
Wow. Yeah.
And we
Was
were
that Mapesh?
That's right, and we were pairing that with hugely inventive Vietnamese food. So it was already a discovery on one sense for the food, and then it was even more discovery when it came to the wine list. And then having those two speak to one another was also another layer of kind of like letting the customer understand that you should trust what we're doing. Um, but not long after that, I was kind of burnt out opening so many restaurants in such a short period of time,
Mhm.
and helping all these other teams kind of figure their own stuff out. And then I ended up working, and so I wanted to kind of focus a little bit more on the wines that I wanted to take a closer look at, and the Jura spun off to Sherry, and one of the best restaurants at the time that had a really extensive, almost a very complete Sherry list, and continues to do so, is at Casamono. Um, One of at the time, a Bastianich restaurant, which was the only Spanish property in the entire portfolio of restaurants that they were running. And I was lucky enough to help run that wine list as well. There were over 500 selections on that list, mostly
Wow.
Spanish, actually entirely Spanish, now that I think about it. And um, the rest of the time, we were lucky enough to be given a little bit of carte blanche to say, what does modern Spanish wine, what's the state of modern Spanish wine look like? And we were bringing in kind of things that would look, I would say, a little more natural, or a little less interventionist, definitely less traditional in terms of what the rest of the set that we were drinking at the time was. And this was
Mhm.
around 2012, 2013.
Wow.
Um, so we were making that transition, we were making that push. And then 2016, the end of 2016 rolled around, and I wasn't really looking to leave, but a headhunter and a mutual friend was basically like, "Hey, there's a Chinese restaurant that is looking to open in Soho. They think that they want to do something that you've been doing here. They saw your track record. They saw what you've been doing with the wines here. Maybe we can have a conversation." I was like, "Yeah, I'll have a conversation. That I'm always open to those." Um, and initially, this Chinese place was going to have, 60 beers and 18 cocktails and like 10 wines. And then I showed them a P&L that basically had mostly wine and then one that had mostly beer. And I said, "You tell me which one you want to work at, because I'm really good at one and I'm okay with another."
Good for
And
you.
that's how we landed at Pinch. And so with the very opening at Pinch, the concept for the wine was a little bit more philosophical. So it's a traditional Chinese restaurant. We don't really make any kind of Chinese American food. This is all very traditional food, either from the mainland or the islands. And the way that we approach the wine is that, if the food and the recipes haven't really changed for as long as they've existed, and this is centuries and centuries of work, sometimes millennia. We were thinking, okay, well, the cuisine follows the moon, the agriculture follows the moon, the culture follows the moon. Um, and we were thinking, okay, well, maybe we can think about wines that do the same thing, maybe wines that follow this flavor profile along this historical route of the Silk Road. And so the very first 2 years of the restaurant was kind of like painstakingly building this notion of that, this is where flavor came from, this is how it migrated, this is how it looked at one thing or the other. And
Well,
then,
what I love about your list when I'm looking at the current March 2024 list
mhm.
is that at the top it says plenty of stuff to drink, but really drink wine, and then
Yeah.
talk to us instead of your wine app.
Yeah, exactly. So we were at that precipice of when everybody just started using their phones for everything else, right? And of course, the symptom of having a wine list, it's a little esoteric, is that everyone's going to want to search what they're drinking anyway. So this was kind of when we started shifting to a little bit more open-ended approach to how we do wine. Our by the glass programming kind of became a little bit more breakout. We did some weird focus things on the wine list. So things like, we were only pouring, or for all of our reds by the glass, we were pouring Merlot, for example, and only Merlot, but in different styles from different places,
Mm.
which always encouraged conversation.
Yeah.
And which ultimately was the thing that we wanted. You were already coming into a place like Pinch, looking to have interesting and good Chinese food. Again, a path to discovery, and then we were going to lead you down an interesting breadcrumb trail with the wines as well. Whether or not it was couched in the Silk Road philosophy or in what we're looking at now, and what you're looking at now currently, which is a very different way of how we've approached wine since, which is, how can we talk about things that matter to us in a way that also invites people to maybe bring back a little bit of that like romance or mysticism or that emotion, in the same way that I felt with Jonathan maybe about 20 years ago. So I think it's a really nice way to pay homage and tribute to the person that sparked my curiosity here. But at the same time, we talk about wine so differently at Pinch because of that reason. I prefer my Psalms to have some foundations, and a lot of the times the Psalms that come to us either have like no formal training or no sales experience on dining room floors. And we almost prefer that because they're so much closer to the vernacular of how we speak about wine on a daily basis, which is to the everyday person.
Oh, love
We speak
that.
about we speak about inclusivity in a way that is total or holistic. We can't just approach wine as an island, or we can't just say, oh, something's so good and it's so delicious. But we always have to ask the question, why and who's it delicious for? And that's something that I'm hoping to train every som that comes through my door, which
That's
is that,
fantastic.
yeah, it's an approach that came from John and Dottie Gay there, is that
Okay.
they've always said that wine is the biggest cultivator for empathy. It's one of the best conduits for empathy. And I could not agree more because at the end of the day, I love telling people, my job isn't to make you drink. My job is to make you fall in love with a story that comes in that glass. And I think that there's a really magical way that we can make that as human as quickly as possible. Because I don't need to tell you about a tasting note in a glass if I can make you care about the person making it. And that goes on either side as well. I can't make you care about the drink that you're going to drink if I can't understand either your dignity or your compassion or your humanity.
That's brilliant. I love that. It's simple but really deep, that gets to the essence of it all. And I
Thank
love that
you.
notion of it as a conduit for empathy, because I think we all just need so much more empathy. And if we approach life with empathy, things get
And
better for everyone.
and it seems like this type of approach would really help take that fear and intimidation out of people trying to choose a wine. And, people are afraid of saying the wrong thing or ordering the wrong thing.
Yeah, absolutely. A language is such a powerful tool that people use to, first off, like find culture, right? And or find um themselves within spaces. And wine itself is its own language. The language of even, we can break it down even further, like the language of tasting wine, the language of like wine trade and wine industry versus
Mhm.
how I would say maybe sell to someone in a retail setting. Those are very different things, right? Those are very different experiences. And let alone we can speak about, say, the language that you and I would use, say, if we were in a class setting or an academic setting, we're talking about objectivity and standards and things like the grid, which are foundationally very good things for us, right? It's good to have standards when we're speaking about language, but when we start weaponizing that language as a thing to divide us or to gatekeep certain kinds of information, then we have to analyze why that language becomes harmful or why we deign to say we shouldn't change that because then someone's bound to lose something. And that's when we kind of need to investigate language, especially in a space like this, where there's already fear and intimidation, like you've said, Mary, where really the what I'm trying to do is not say level a playing field, but all I'm trying to say is there's way more richness when we turn the conversation horizontally as opposed to vertically. Because the knowledge is everywhere. The knowledge is everywhere around us. The culture has given us that. All of these separate cultures that come together in a place like America give us this opportunity to kind of meet and bump into each other and run into each other in really curious and interesting ways. And wine, unfortunately, and the academic level doesn't allow us for that. There's no such thing as helpful friction in speaking about wine and say in a class setting, because for a lot of the time, you're wrong if it's not in that little box.
Right.
Mm.
Um, and there's no such thing as grace to say, okay, well, maybe I don't know where you're coming from, and maybe we can maybe approach this fruit or this tasting note that you're trying to tell me, and how I can maybe find the thing that makes it relatable for you when we're talking about tasting notes here.
Well,
So, oh no, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, your background being Filipino, I mean, that also references a lot of different flavors than you would necessarily find in a sommelier class. Am I right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I wrote this article for Wine and Spirits magazine not too long ago about feeling a little bit isolated in a diploma level class. We're talking about Cab Franc, and we're talking about very, very deep Burgoy, and I pick up notes of like deep tamarind every time I taste Cabernet Franc from the Loire Valley.
Mm.
And I told my teacher this, and I was like, I think this is really exciting for me. I finally understand when this kind of acidity and this kind of tannin match. It reminds me of tasting this kind of tamarind candy when I was growing up. And she looked at me puzzled, as if I was speaking an alien language, because she was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I have no idea what tamarind tastes like. I have no point of reference for this. So I was felt feeling like I was on a raft in the middle of an ocean at that point. I was
Sure.
like, how can I don't know what a black currant is. It's been banned, it had been banned in New York for hundreds of years because of a
Yeah.
pest issue. And so for me to maybe kind of take a look at how I could approach this. Not to say that it's an entitlement, but it is just maybe saying that there's a cultural sensitivity that we have to reach if we're trying to reach a more global audience with wine. And I felt very much that, and that person who was looking for a lifeboat, because how was it that I had all of these years of working with storied chefs and great ingredients and all of this, also all of this good wine and great sommeliers, but at the same time, now when I'm trying to legitimize and certify myself in the same profession, they're saying all of your experiences have been wrong and all of your experiences have been misdirected because this doesn't exist in this plane. I
Right.
felt lonely, 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 lonely. And the saving grace was in my tasting group was this Trinidadian woman who, when we talked about Cab Franc that week in the class, I was like, I'm not sure if I'm just going crazy or not, but I find tamarind in this wine. And her hand shot up and says, you know what? We have these little tamarind candies in Trinidad. And I was like, the same. I was like, they look exactly the same and they taste exactly the same. And I know exactly what you're talking about. And at that moment, I was like, okay, maybe we're onto something here when we just maybe eschew the grid altogether for a moment and find maybe that really interesting human connection where I can say, "Hey, does this seem somewhat familiar to you? And how can we meet each other halfway here? Because I know it's here. My experience is really telling me that it's here." And
Mhm.
I think your experience is telling me that it's there too. Maybe the setting is different. Maybe your sunsets look a little different. Maybe the air of your ocean smells a little bit different. But you know what? I think we're tasting the same thing. And that kind of discovery, wine was the only way that we would have had that experience clearly. But wine was also the only experience that was distancing us from finding one another that way.
Yeah, that's
Right.
so
How
interesting
interesting.
about the
And there was this
distancing.
notion of something's correct and something's incorrect. Tamarind, that's not correct. That's not what we are learning here. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
No, but it's, I think, a factor in what turns people off from wine. We were discussing right before we started about how the younger generations are just not drinking wine and they're not interested. They're turned off by it for whatever reasons. And so I think, you know, you bring up a really good point, Miguel, about, the language and also kind of the gatekeeping. And so I want to kind of dig into your article about decolonizing wine. Um,
Hmm.
what inspired you to write that? And what's been the outcome 4 years later since that article appeared?
Um, I mean, great question. In June of 2020 was about 1 or 2 weeks after George Floyd was murdered, and I think that was a big flashpoint for a lot of people in the industry, especially if you're a person of color.
Right.
Um, there was kind of an immediate sense of understanding that you can't turn away from this. There was nothing to turn away from, right? Because everyone was stuck indoors and everyone finally had to kind of face what this thing was that they had maybe silently acknowledged or maybe just like weren't able to fully comprehend because they didn't have time, they didn't want to acknowledge it. There are all these other factors. I honestly the birth of that article was me just trying to be as honest as I could be.
Mhm.
I just wanted to tell everybody, hey, if Julia Coney feels this way and she's angry talking about it on an Instagram live, I was like, I'm not really a good person as an off the cuff kind of like telling someone what to do. I get very nervous, I get very fidgety. And so I'd rather just write it out. And really that stream of consciousness came out in about 2 hours. I was like, here's what I remember happening. And then I showed it to Talia Bayoki, my editor at Punch, and I was like, "Would this be something that you think would run in this place?" And she was like, "All we need to do is really clean it up structurally, and here it is." And not too long after that, maybe a day or two, um, later, it was published, and it somehow sent shockwaves around town. But
It did.
before then, I had written an article that was self-published called, actionable things that you can do for the wine community. It was things about like, protesting, how we take care of each other, how do we make sure, how is it that this racial reckoning um is something that wine is dealing with, and why is it that's something that you should care about? And then immediately after the decolonized article published, I also wrote something that I wrote also self-published, that was titled 10 Things You Can Do to Destroy White Supremacy in Wine. And
Mm.
so that kind of like triptych of articles really addressed this thing that all of my friends in the wine circle, all of my sommelier friends, all of the people that I was in industry with and in community with at the time were all experiencing. We were just saying, how is it that it's just now that we're finally getting recognized? It's just, or even talking about this idea or notion of privilege, right?
Mhm.
I had to be 4 times better than the next person just to get my foot in the door.
Mhm.
And just because that other person knew a connection, or went to the same school, or went through the same restaurant track in terms of the resume, they get they get 5 more figures as opposed to what it is that we're trying to do here. Um, and so a lot of that frustration about inequality and maybe especially the gatekeeping, and especially these things that we've been talking about, uh, things like language, things like the really sticky point in our wine careers when we understand that legitimacy and certification are one and the same,
Mm.
and how we can maybe divorce those things because we don't necessarily then we invite things like gatekeeping over and over and over again,
Mhm.
or maybe talking about this notion of the drug that is white adjacency in our wine cultures, where we think maybe the correct thing is the white thing to do,
Oh,
because
yeah.
it's the only thing that we've understood for so long. I love
Right.
bringing this idea back about the
Mhm.
WSET, and the start of the WSET, and I tell people this all the time. It's that the reason why the WSET headquarters are in London is that in the mid 1800s there were people who owned wine shops in Britain who needed to talk about wine to sell to their people who were going on sea voyages, and then that somehow that organization of wine sellers has become the arbiter for how we speak about wine. And isn't that in itself like a parallel of the colonial mindset of the 1860s, like Britain, Pax Britannica mindset of it all? I was like,
Yeah.
there's ways that we can unlearn and unbrush all of these things away. And maybe it sounds a little too philosophical, or maybe it sounds too optimistic for some people. But at the same time, we wouldn't be having this conversation if we didn't realize that the consequences were this dire.
Mm.
Absolutely. Okay, so you wrote that article in 2020.
That's
4 years later, fast forward, has anything changed in your perspective? Have we moved the needle at all?
I mean, the needle's moved slightly, although just like a lot of big things, um, we have to we're still continuing to ignore a pandemic, and now we're also continuing to ignore genocides that are happening around us. As much as we want to say that wine is a luxury product and wine isn't political, the fact that it grows on land that plants don't care about, that plants can't care about borders or geologies or things like that, and why we as people kind of impose this idea that we're the ones that experience wine in the best way possible because we understand all the things that happen and the climate that is different and all those things too. I was like, well, the human movement is also the biggest factor, or I guess the biggest thing that is relevant to vintage. And so things like language. I mean, there was a push in around 2020 for places like the WCT and the court to maybe reanalyze their grids, and that I think that project has ground to a halt,
Mm.
unfortunately.
That's too
A lot
bad.
of the leader, yeah, a lot of the leadership really is, and again, because education is such a big beast to kind of shift. It's funny to me that wine loves a market trend. I think you and I have all seen Rosé and Pinot Grigio, and then most recently this
Right.
whole memification of Josh. And we
Yes.
can catch up to those things all of a sudden very quickly, right? But somehow the burden of republishing a book or changing a fact item on a dictionary or encyclopedia is so hard for people, let alone in terms of a modern curriculum where, even say like your standard level one class, we'll still talk only about France for the
Right.
first 3 weeks and
Hmm.
then bring everything else into the fold. And, maybe it's time to reconsider that, if we're talking about things like growing local or growing organic or understanding our local markets, maybe we
Hmm.
can look at wine education be cited a little bit more locally as well. But then again, that's going to require a lot of willpower that unfortunately isn't quite there because there's so many other things that wine links itself with, and whether or not that looks like taxes or tariffs, or in even bigger scales, general agriculture,
Hmm.
we can't really move needles too much if the policies around, say, even the consumption of wine. Let's talk about this three-tier system on another podcast, I'm sure.
Right.
Where this continual problem of like the language of prohibition that is 100 years old, hasn't really stood a chance because the people who are still benefiting from those laws either aren't dying or they're aging out in a way that is really ungraceful, because they're unwilling to let these things go to
Hmm.
make things as more inclusive, equitable, and approachable to more people.
Mm.
Wow. Yes. Yes. There are, and those barriers to wine being more inclusive and diverse, those are, those are tough walls to break down, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if we can talk about maybe um, just gender parity for sommeliership.
Sure. Sure.
I mean, how do you feel as women in wine? I
Well,
feel like you always have to find the person in the room that looks like you, right?
right.
Right.
Right. And I can tell you I have done certifications, the certified SOM and WSET 3. And even with that, and the reason I did it, I've always been a journalist. I really had no intention of working the floor, but I wanted to take knowledge I had and commodify it so I could be taken more seriously.
Mhm. If it's that kind of taking that academic stock as part of that notion of that thing that I was talking to you about earlier, where certification and legitimacy are one and the
Hmm.
same in this industry.
Absolutely. But honestly, I learned more as the executive producer of the TV show in Wine Country that we shot over 10 years than I did through getting those certifications. I learned
Absolutely.
I learned so much more traveling to wine regions, especially on my own, and meeting the people, tasting the wine and the place it's made, more so than I could ever learn in a classroom.
Absolutely. I think the biggest difference that people need to take away, I think, when it comes to this like academic versus I would say like maybe like more everyday or quotidian divide, is that wine for us, wine is work. A lot,
Yeah.
a lot of friends are always kind of, or people I'm meeting for the first time whenever you introduce yourself, right? Yeah, I'm a wine professional. I'm a sommelier. Immediately their head goes to, oh my gosh, like what a fun job. Like you must be drinking wine all the time. You must be tasting wine all the time. All the time. I'm like,
Exactly.
yes. Yeah, it's like, yes, that is part of the thing, but I wouldn't really necessarily consider that as a perk as I'm slowly poisoning my body. But if we look at it on this big way, also, I get to really meet a lot of people in really interesting parts of their lives, who are committing themselves to what feels like the most masochistic job there is, which is tending the land for grapes. And that in itself is curious to me. It's like why this as the art medium? Why this as the communication tool? Why this as the conduit for empathy? And the more you get
Mm.
into it, you realize that like people just really have a beautiful relationship with the earth, and somehow I want to be able to transmit that story for someone else because what they're making is so transcendent and delicious and magical. And when that spark of the first taste of something hits your lips and your eyes open up and you feel that crackle down your spine, you're like, okay, now I'm here and now I want to know why it's making me feel this way. To
Mhm.
me, it's the most like sensual artistic practice that we can find as human beings. And there's no other more immediate way to do that than letting time speak for itself in bottles that we cultivate in our cellars. And so to me, like one of the most important things that we find in this whole kind of like empathetic journey that we're going on is that, ultimately the story that you're telling um, is you're the only person that can tell it. But here I am as a person who's trying to make sure that the page is as clean as possible, or I'm also trying to make sure that, like, there's ink in your pen, or that there's a brush for you to use, because we can maybe do this a little bit differently. Maybe we're not writing it. Maybe we're just closer to the margins, or maybe we're using a different font, or maybe we're using different paintbrushes when we're making this happen. But I don't make wine at all, but I do love the fact that I can tell someone else's story using theirs.
Gosh,
And again, I'm just being like the middleman for how all these other multitudes of stories are being told.
I love the way you talk about your job and wine. And I can hear so much passion and excitement in your voice just telling us this stuff. And you've been at this a long time now. And in recent years, you've made a name for yourself by saying courageous things and shaking up the status quo or trying to. Do you ever feel fatigue or a sense of responsibility to be a spokesperson for change in the wine world? Is it
Uh,
like, do people look to you all the
Absolutely.
time? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like it's a it's a big responsibility to be the first, but it's an even bigger responsibility to be the loudest. Um,
Mhm.
and I think that's where I'm landing. I wasn't the first Filipino sommelier. I wasn't the first to uh even get an award through the James Beard for like how I think about beverage. But I feel ultimately responsible for like all the things that intersect that I represent. So, I'm not just a Filipino. I'm not just an immigrant. I'm not just a queer person. I'm not just a Berkeley alum. I'm not just all of these other things that make me feel like I am this kind of complete person. But I also represent all those other people who view themselves through that lens as me, right? So I feel ultimately responsible for like my success being also part of like the Filipino American success, or maybe the queer success, or maybe even on the root on the rah-rah thing of like maybe this is an American success story also. And that's a hard thing to reconcile. I'm I'm getting to the point where I'm just getting comfortable saying thank you to when someone compliments me. This is really wonderful work that my therapist is going to hear about. Um, but it's also understanding that, it's the the bar is low when all we're trying to do is understand that when someone approaches you about how you can maybe help them with their full expression of their dignity or their humanity, that it's an easy thing for you to do, then why not do it, right? One of my Psalms identifies using they them pronouns, and they brought it up at a meeting not too long ago, saying, hey, maybe we can have uh, a chat with the rest of the staff about how we use pronouns and how we use maybe things that don't don't feel right or don't feel good whenever I hear them used for me. Um, and they were like, but I don't want to push it. And the first thing that I said was, first off, if it's about your dignity and your well-being mentally, physically, and emotionally in your workspace, tell me.
Mhm.
Second, like this is the barest minimum that we can ask someone else, is to respect who you are as a
Mhm.
person. And there's so many other parallels that we can use to that on how we talk about wine practice, Like, no, there's no such thing to me. There's no such thing as one thing being better than the other, just because it's price. This is also coming from a very kind of like
Mm.
collectivist perspective that my Berkeley education has given me, which is, there's so many other ways that we can think about richness or wealth.
Right.
And it's not always top down, or like it's not always this capitalistic view that, the money comes from the top and it helps develop a middle class, which helps develop all those other things. I think in a way the culture that I grew up in, which is, Filipino, and at the very heart of it, the philosophy of Filipino is this notion of uh, it's a word called kapwa, and kapwa really means, you know, how do we understand our social standing with one another, for one another? Like, how am I showing up for you? Because that's how I become the best person for my community. Um, and how do we raise each other up, right? There's also a notion of this wonderful concept in Filipino philosophy called bayanihan, which means raising nations together, or in the very small sense, like raising towns together. So it is the complete like word version of it takes a village. Because you're not alone in terms of how you're feeling about something, or um it takes little effort if everybody does it, to understand that we can maybe push the goalpost further just to make everything better for everybody.
Sure. Well, I think it'd be really interesting over the next decade to see, especially with what happens with some of these legacy wine publications who are kind of the gatekeepers, the 100-point scores, um, you know, the certifying bodies, if there's going to be evolution change, or as the those generations who've been very entrenched in those entities age out of the industry, and there's hopefully younger voices, more diverse voices, finally getting some oxygen to their points of view, our points of view, much more accepting and open and diverse. What do you think?
I think, let's see, well, it starts with this understanding of like what do we treasure as a wine culture, right? And that's something that I think we need to be answering as a group. Because right now it seems like there's a group of people, or groups of people that think what they're doing is right and it's correct and it's the way forward and it's the only way that they've understood wine, right?
Right.
We talk about the divide between, say, like traditionalists and like people who are in the natural wine community, um, and why those audiences look inherently different. We talk about, say, even certifying bodies, right? And how there's been some progress, right? So the Court of Master Psalms has like rescinded their gender dress code recently, which is a good step in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you could still get docked for personality points if you're presenting too feminine, or if you're presenting too masculine and it's not your body. So
Seriously? Oh
there's,
my
I
goodness.
mean, there's you. Are we surprised, really? I mean, there's still people who are going to get mad that we're talking about this on a 45-minute episode on a podcast. You know what I mean? Like, there's still going to be somebody who's like, I think that viewpoint's wrong because I don't see it. And I mean, that's great that you
Okay.
have blinders on, but the
Hmm.
rest of the world needs to understand that, again, if we're going to consider wine as a global market for global culture, where are you in terms of catching this all up, right? And if
Hmm.
everyone else in the world is being open and honest and transparent about things that go into the bottle, right? So maybe in Europe there's a big push to talk about, you know, maybe we need to put ingredients on a label. Maybe we need to start putting this thing where, say, this kind of pesticide was used in this facility, or on this vineyard, where that's not the question here, because they don't see that as a problem, right? Again, there's stakeholders that are going to be angry if we even talk about Roundup, um, on a wine podcast,
Hmm.
because someone's always benefiting from using that as a marker for, say, it's better wine because you don't have to do X, Y, and Z things. So again, I'm all about this understanding that we need to be more horizontal about how we speak about knowledge, and how we maybe distribute this kind of knowledge. But as people, like you ask, as people kind of age out, um, there is, to me, like, what do we treasure about how we've come to know wine through those perspectives? They're still valuable, right? That we still speak about, you know, I don't think that we would have a conversation about tannin without Robert Parker.
Mm-hmm.
because I think that those two things are one and the same to me. Like the whole reason why everybody started understanding the word tannin and the way that people understood the hedonistic pleasure of big, bold reds was because of that man. And generationally, he's affected how people drank. And then again, there's also flashpoints in culture where, you know, it's been almost 20 years when Sideways came out, and we're still talking about Merlot being a bust on a wine list if you put it on.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's things that we have to consider here, which is what is important to us really. And um, I think it's for us now as a generation of people who are now defining taste to say, well, what's a trend versus, you know, what is a path to understanding this as a bigger kind of cultural treasure. Um, because we have to understand that, like, you know, wine is a part of all of these cultures. And as much as we want to say that it is inherently European, it's unfortunately in 2024, it is so global. You know, I had just gotten back from traveling in Asia, and I drank wine
Mm,
in the Philippines. I drank wine in Thailand. I drank wine in South Korea, and none of those places you would have considered as a wine place, maybe even 10 years ago.
right.
But now all of them are having diverse, rich conversations about natural wine versus traditional wine, young people drinking wine, and how that can maybe inculcate into, say, like their cocktail drinking culture, or their beer drinking culture, or how those things can just happen.
Mm,
And so the vocabulary is here, and the willingness for people to try wine is here. Um, but I think it's up to us as a group of people to say, what do we stand to lose when we break open the gate? Because because who, and I think this is the power dynamic that we've been reaching at from the very beginning, is that who is drinking and who gets to tell you what to drink are
hmm.
two really powerful things to consider in terms of what we consider as the part of the wine culture that is like right now.
That's
Yeah,
so true.
amen to that.
And, the status quo is not working. So something needs to change.
Right,
Mhm.
in terms of like if you look at sales nationally. So when you look at the young people, or where do you think we're going? Who are the young people getting into wine, and how are they different, or are
I
they?
mean, you're right. It's just that, you know, there's always been people who love wine, and there's always been people who love wine who look very different from you and I, and that's a good thing, right? I think it's just now that we're trying to understand that, like, when we're talking about legitimacy and certification in these paths, or maybe like trying to find wine as a viable career option, that the kind of person that used to go for the wine thing is inherently different now, right? They're more curious, they're more engaged, they're more culturally aware. Um, I wouldn't say that they're skewing younger necessarily, but they are just way more open to the possibilities of what wine can do for them. And you know, I liken it to understanding that when it's just now that we started maybe talking about, you know, multiverses being a real thing, or because of the prevalence of maybe like comic book movies, that the understanding of what we know of our universe versus another universe, right? All those
Hmm.
things are valid, all those things are real. We're just getting to that part now in wine. Right, where it's not just vinifera
Right.
that we can make good wine with. Like there's hybrids in the
Yeah.
Loire, there's PVs in Germany,
Yeah.
there's hybrids in America. There's
Right.
even things that, like, there's wines that are mixed with apple ciders.
Sure.
There's foraged blueberry wines out in Maine.
Right.
Um,
And
and
what,
even and even and even in this multiverse of like domesticity, even, we can talk about, okay, well, it's not just the coasts that are making wine. There's wine in Texas and in Virginia and in Michigan and in Maryland and in Colorado, and
mhm.
all these places that we wouldn't consider because they're, I don't know, culturally we haven't really treasured them the same way. There's an openness for this kind of group of people to say, okay, well, I'm willing to do the homework to make sure that if this is delicious, that if these people are doing right by the earth, by each other, and by for one another, then maybe it's worthy to put on a wine list. And that's part of the criteria that, like, how we think about it at Pinch, for example. We do a really big ethics check before wine even comes through our door. We talk to our distributors, and our winemakers about, hey, do your people have access to healthcare? Which it sounds counterintuitive, because those things are never going to be put on a tech sheet.
Yeah.
But when you start asking these questions, you kind of start to understand who understands being compassionate or being human or being empathetic way quicker because the person that you're asking about is all I'm asking about is, hey, can you care about the person who's helping you make your wine? And if you
Hmm.
can't answer me that with a straight face, maybe I don't need to defend your wine because the story that I need to tell doesn't feel complete or doesn't feel right or doesn't feel ingenuous.
What a great approach.
I totally agree. I love that. So many of the things you've talked about today are um, just so many great nuggets of information and really eye-opening. Miguel de Leon, thank you for such an enlightening conversation, teaching us about, called it the empathetic journey of wine. I loved that. And I also love that you invite us to be more curious than certain when it comes to wine. And I think that's so smart and so important. And really, I loved it when you said how can we raise each other up in the wine world, and all of that is so important and so much food for thought. So thank you for sharing with all of that with us and your own personal story as well.
Of course, thank you so much
Yes.
for having me.
And
I think it brings it back to the understanding that, you and I are never going to taste every bottle of wine that's ever been made. But I think the more of us who kind of understand that, hey, if we invite as many people into here, maybe we'll get a bigger understanding of why this thing makes us tick so well.
absolutely, absolutely. And Miguel, thank you. We will be putting links to all of your articles on our show notes on our podcast website. And you've also left us with some items that are actionable for all of us listening today. So I appreciate that.
Thank you so much for having me. I think the most important thing to take away from something like this would be, you know, if there's a bottle that you want to drink, maybe invite a person that you wouldn't normally have thought of to be part of your circle to do it with. It's a nice way to kind of bring a conversation, but also put these things into practice.
Oh, Miguel, wonderful. We need more of you. Thank you for all of it. And we really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. And we look forward to talking to you again another time.
Cheers.
Cheers. Sip, sip,
Cheers.
hooray.
Sip, sip, hooray.
Well, Mary Orlin, Miguel de Leon, what a dynamo and what a positive force for change in the wine industry. It is time, and I am so grateful that he is speaking truths in a really encouraging and hopeful way.
Even if those truths are uncomfortable for some people to hear, it needs to be said, it needs to be heard. And hopefully it will start sinking in more. There's been a little progress, but we have so far to go.
Mm-hmm. And we're all better when we cast the net a little wider, bring more people in. I love his last
Absolutely.
idea. Invite someone different to drink,
Yeah.
someone outside of your normal circle to enjoy your next bottle of wine with you. I love
Mhm.
that notion.
And as I mentioned, we'll be posting all of Miguel's articles on our show notes at sipsiphooraypodcast.com. You can also see more of our previous episodes there. It's great to binge when you want to listen to something terrific.
It sure is. And you can also find us on Instagram and Facebook. And we also want to invite you to subscribe to our Substack, Sip Sip Hooray podcast, where you'll find other adjacent information and articles and things about wine and just be part of our wine family.
And you can subscribe to our podcast via Substack so you'll get an email as soon as the next episode drops. And whatever platform you listen to us on, we'd really appreciate it if you give us a rating, write a review, and subscribe to us on that platform. It helps us be discovered by other wine lovers too.
As always, we thank you so much for listening, and we appreciate you sharing Sip Sip Hooray podcast with other people. And go enjoy a great glass of wine with a diverse group of friends.
Absolutely. And cheers and sip, sip, hooray to that.
Cheers.